Greetings everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Fanfic Read Through. I am Tobacco94 and I'm reading for you this fanfic I wrote. In case you were wondering what the zooming or buzzing noise is that you can hear sometimes in the background, that's the road right outside my window. Or sometimes it's my cat playing around, especially when it's bumping noises, 'cause she loves to jump around. Anyhow, I'm not gonna take up more of your time. So, here it is. House Trip, Chapter 13 to 14. Sam was having a heated discussion on the web with some of her fellow vegetarians when the relative calm of the waiting room was broken by a very familiar woman's voice. Looking up from her phone, she saw Vlad looking over at the entrance, an amused look on his face. Following his gaze, Sam could see why he was smiling. Jazz Fenton was glaring down at Dash, something quite impressive, seeing as he was almost a head taller than her. "I've had it with you, Dash. You were sweet and adorable when you asked me to be your tutor, because you liked me, but you have gone too far this time." Dash swallowed. He had cuts and scrapes on his hands, and some leaves were stuck in his hair. "You have got to believe me, he began, but Jazz was not in the least interested in hearing his excuses. "You what? Got angry because you didn't do so well on a test? Lost your temper because things weren't going your way? Got pissed off because someone was better than you at something?" Mr. Lance was moving to interrupt Jazz, a look of indifference on his face. "No, he just pissed me off, so I—" began Dash, but once more Jazz cut him off. "Beat him up and threw him into a poisonous bush," she finished for Dash, an uncomfortable silence stretching out over the next seconds. Sam stared at the scene in front of her. Dash was bowing his head in defeat, almost shrinking, whereas Jazz, unlike her normal self, seemed threatening. Exchanging a surprised look with Miss Lancer, she stayed quiet. Finally Dash spoke. "He wouldn't fight back. It's frustrating when he just takes the beating and doesn't even tell the teachers who did it." Hands on her hip, Jazz stared Dash straight in the eyes. "Have it ever occurred to you that my brother is way stronger than you?" she said in a normal voice. Dash made a face. "Fenton's a coward, a wimp. I've seen him in gym. He's weaker than his geek friend." Dash shook her head. "My brother doesn't fight back because he doesn't want to hurt anyone, Dash. He takes the bullying because he'd rather you pick on him than any of the younger students. He hates fighting, Dash." Her words were a slap across Dash's cheek. She turned around before the joker could say anything, went over to Sam and Mr. Lancer. "Why didn't you ever tell him that when you were in high school?" asked Sam, getting up from her seat and hugging Jazz. "'Cause then he wouldn't let me," she answered, and Sam was suddenly aware of the older girl shaking. "I have never seen an outburst like that from you before, Miss Fenton. Are you all right?" asked Mr. Lancer, getting up from his seat as well. Letting go of Sam, Jazz rubbed her face. "Yeah, I'll be fine as soon as I get to see my little brother and give him a piece of my mind as well," she said and smiled. "Where is he?" Vlad had moved away from the group before Jazz could notice him, and was observing the touching moment from a distance. However much he'd like to talk to Jazz and inform her of his brilliance, it wasn't the moment to do it, not when she was lashing out at anyone who got in her way. Passing Dash on his way out, Vlad considered giving the bully some words of advice, but the red-haired doctor walked over to Dash in just that moment, and Vlad left without saying a word. Dr. Smith touched a cotton swab to one of the small cuts around Danny's eyes, cleaning the wound out with disinfectant. Expecting the boy to hiss in discomfort, she was surprised when he smiled. "Did I say something funny?" she asked. Looking at her in surprise, Danny shook his head. "No, I was just listening to a conversation." Smith raised an eyebrow and listened as well. She could hear the conversation from the doctor taking care of the man with a broken leg, and the small conversations between nurses and patients, but nothing that sounded funny or interesting to a teenager. Yawning, Danny winced and looked over at Dr. Smith. She raised an eyebrow. "Your throat hurting?" she asked, not sure that he was even feeling the sting of the disinfectant. "Bit." The cotton swab caught on something, and Danny twitched. "Ow," he said, in the same monotone voice, as if feeling the pain but just saying the words, more for show than because he was actually hurting. "Hold still," said Dr. Smith, getting a pair of tweezers. She gripped the small object and looked at it. Just a piece of glass, she said, wondering how he hadn't felt it before. She picked up a new swab and started cleaning out that cut, when she heard the door opening behind her, and then his face lit up. Sam had opened the door to the emergency room again, and held it open for Jazz and Mr. Lancer. Seeing his sister, Danny felt a weight lift off his shoulder. "Danny," she said, walking straight over to him. "Hi, sis. Fancy meeting you here," he said, and instead of getting the expected smothering hug that he always got, she punched him on the right thigh, where she knew he'd been injured 2 weeks earlier. "Hi there, brother," she said, watching Danny bend forward over his leg, cursing the woman who punched half-healed injuries. "What was that? An apology for making me worry myself sick over you?" Having heard Jazz scolding of Dash, Danny went along. "I'm sorry I worried you," he said between clenched teeth, as the pain in his leg subsided to a dull ache. Dr. Smith looked weirdly at Danny. "I will accept your apology. How are you?" said Jazz, and looked over at the doctor beside him. "How's my little brother?" she asked, completely ignoring him. "He's doing remarkably well," Dr. Smith said, then looked at Danny. "I have some papers that needs to be filled out. Do you mind coming with me?" she asked, taking off her latex gloves. Danny watched his sister walk over to the nurse's station with Dr. Smith, who also got Mr. Lancer involved with what they were talking about. "You can hear what they are saying, right?" asked Sam, placing Danny's backpack on the bed. "Also, brought your stuff along," she said. Nodding, Danny opened his bag. "They are talking about me. The doctor is worried about my scars, my numbness of pain, and so on," he said, digging out the hoodie he'd packed down before they put on the overalls. "It's getting harder and harder to hide your secret with every hospital visit. Do you think they'll ever guess the truth?" asked Sam, watching Danny shrug into the hoodie. "If we can just keep things up till the end of high school, then everything will be fine," he said. "You know, if your parents knew that you were still planning to finish high school with the life you got, they'd be proud of you," said Sam, and Danny turned to look at her, and then both looked away, something unspoken said between them. Danny listened in on the conversation a bit more, but stopped when Jess obviously had had enough and started doing what she did best: get Danny out of difficult society problems. It wasn't long before Dr. Smith returned to Danny, an annoyed look on her face. "Your sister is filling out the paperwork," she said, and pressed a button on the heart monitor, getting a long piece of paper. A couple of minutes later she removed the electrodes from Danny's chest, listened to his breathing one more time before removing the oxygen cannula. Before she could say anything more, Danny was off the bed and hitched his backpack over one shoulder. Placing her hands on her hips, she raised an eyebrow. "Eager to leave?" she asked, noticing that Danny wasn't putting his weight on his right leg. "Didn't I tell you? I'd rather not be here at all," he said, and Sam lent him her shoulder to support him as they walked over to Jazz and Mr. Lancer. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Walking through the waiting room, Danny saw Dash get up from where he'd been sitting beside a red-haired woman. "Fenton," he said, and Danny sighed. Stopping, he considered his options. He wanted to give Dash a beating he'd never forget. He wanted to make the larger boy piss himself. At the same time, he just wanted to be left alone to sleep. Looking up at his sister's raised eyebrow, he rolled his eyes and turned to Dash. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice crackling as he spoke. Dash seemed surprised that Danny had actually stopped and talked to him. "Hey, no hard feelings? I didn't mean to hurt you," said Dash, trying to be cool, but Danny could taste his guilt. Letting go of Sam's supporting shoulder, Danny faced Dash, his eyes void of emotions. "Sorry, Dash, but you meant to hurt me. Just because you didn't think of the consequences of your actions doesn't mean that you can't get away with almost killing me." Hadn't his throat been hurting so much, Danny would have spoken in a lower tone than he did. Dash took a step backwards. "It's not my fault I didn't know." He was still holding his head high, trying to look bigger than he felt. "Ignorance is no excuse, Dash. It's just a lack of knowledge," said Jess, her turquoise eyes venomous. Danny had to stop himself from shuddering, feeling his sister's anger more than tasting it. Turning away from Dash, Danny stopped. Looking at his sister, he smiled. "And by the way, Dash, my sister was right. I won't fight back unless I really want to hurt you." He glanced at Dash and licked his cut lip. Shuddering, Dash took another step backwards, bumping into the chair and sat down hard. Danny smiled at the sudden fear in Dash's eyes and limped out, supported by Sam once more. Walking out, Mr. Lancer turned to the three. I can't say that I disagree with what you said to Dash. However, Danny, you could at least have accepted his apology. We didn't know about your allergy. Wrinkling his nose, Danny avoided meeting Mr. Lancer's eyes. It's not like I died or anything, he muttered, underneath his breath so only Sam could hear him. Smiling, she elbowed him gently. Trust me, Mr. Lancer, if anything, Dash might have learned his lesson this time, said Jazz, suddenly back to her cheery sunshine self. That would be the only good thing to come out of this trip, said Mr. Lancer in his normal bleak tone. Anyhow, I have to go back to the boot camp with Mr. Baxter and Samantha. I trust you'll go back to Emmett Park with your brother, he said, talking to Jazz, completely ignoring Sam and Danny, who were standing right there beside him. I will. I haven't had a road trip with my little brother in a while, said Jazz, ruffling Danny's hair, as he muttered something under his breath. It's going to be fun catching up again. Would it be all right if I left too, Mr. Lancer? Asked Sam, and Danny got the feeling she had something planned. I wasn't feeling that well this morning, and playing around in the forest, you know. Besides, I think my team won the first game, she said, all innocent. Mr. Lancer eyed her and then shook his head in defeat. Just leave the overalls in the car. I don't want to be accused of stealing. The same goes for you, Fenton. Smiling, Sam dragged Danny over to the car that Mr. Lancer had borrowed from one of the instructors. What are you planning? Asked Danny when they were out of earshot. Sam glared at him. When were you going to tell us that Vlad short-circuited your powers? Or wasn't I hearing correctly? She hissed, bending down to untie her boots. Cursing, Danny scratched the back of his neck. I should really stop muttering to myself, he sighed, sinking down to sit on the ground beside the car, untying his own shoes. Yes, you should. Care to tell me what happened when Vlad talked to you? Or were you still out cold when he short-circuited your powers? She got one boot off, and balancing on one leg, she tugged the pants leg of the overalls down. I was awake, said Danny, and then told her about the conversation with Vlad. The effects only last for 3 hours, and then I'm back to walking through walls, disappearing and flying around. They had gotten the overalls off by the time he was finishing his story, and were putting on their shoes again. Sam sat down beside Danny. And what about the side effects, Clueless? You don't imagine that the antidote Vlad gave you, which by the way was foolish, will fix everything like that? She snapped her fingers. You don't think you can just turn ghost before it has run its course and gotten rid of the blood blossom, do you? She tugged on her heavy boots. Leaning forward to tug on his right shoe, Danny thought about what Sam had said and what Vlad had said. I won't go ghost this weekend, if I don't have to. If you are right, I'd rather not experience the agony. He shuddered at the thought of the picture Vlad had painted of the flower's effect on his ghost half. So how long till the antidote takes effect? Asked Sam, tying her other boots and avoiding eye contact with Danny. Moving over to his other shoe, Danny shrugged. I think it's already working, he said, glancing over at Sam. She was looking back at him, an eyebrow raised, and Danny reached out and placed his hand against her cheek. It took Sam a moment to realize why he did it. When she did, she gripped his hand and looked in his eyes. You're warm, she said. She, Tucker, and Jazz were the only people who knew that Danny had a normal body temperature below 30 degrees Celsius and was often cold to the touch. Yeah, he said, getting to his feet. End of chapter 14. Thank you for listening.